For everyone with an interest in MASH or more broadly steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 6, Episode 2 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami. Our second episode in the new V2.0 format starts now.
For the last 5 years, MASLD stakeholders, whether manufacturers, trial sites, providers, payers, patients, or investors, have turned to Surfing the MASH Tsunami to keep track of drug and device development, epidemiology, and practice patterns. This week, the Roundtable discussion explores issues regarding MetALD and ALD itself from February's AASLD Emerging Topics Conference in Las Vegas. Newsmaker Hannes Hagstrom discusses a recently released paper he co-authored in the Journal of Hepatology. And primary care physician Emily Andeya discusses her journey from planning to be a cardiologist to focusing her career on MASLD and MASH. All on this week's Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
This week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
As far as I can see with the knowledge we have, and again the burden on transplant and in-hospital service underestimated the burden of alcohol, and that's a mistake. If you're lean or have a BMI above 30, alcohol is 4 times more toxic. So that means that a risk factor is not 1 + 1 is 2, no, 1 + 1 is 5.
Do we, Alexander, need to therefore define better hazardous drinking by people's background conditions, whether or not their BMI is at a certain level, whether or not they've got diabetes, whether or not they're lean? Because it's not something that I see a lot in primary care awareness.
You can get some pretty good absolute estimates to convey to patients saying, well, your risk of death, if you're a standard sort of MASLD patient, your risk of death would be sort of this and that.
I think it's not only the average patient, though. I mean, if you think about treaters who are not so aware of MASLD, they wouldn't know any of these things either.
With American Heart Association programs, we were one of the few participants who achieved what they call perfect trifecta in diabetes, cholesterol, and blood pressure.
When you say did really well or achieved perfect trifecta, what level of performance are we talking about there?
Knowing that insulin resistance is the main cause of cardiovascular disease and renal problem. And I realized we're just taking care of the complications of fatty liver. That's just the downstream of the disease process. And I am thinking maybe we can make a big difference if we go a little bit upstream.
Our sponsors for Season 6 include
Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, Inc. is a biopharmaceutical company focused on delivering novel therapeutics for metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis, or MASH, a liver disease with high unmet medical need. Madrigal's medication, Rezdiffra resmetirom, is a once-daily oral, liver-directed THR beta agonist designed to target key underlying causes of MASH. Rezdiffra is the first and only medication approved by the FDA for the treatment of MASH with moderate to advanced fibrosis, consistent with stages F2 to F3. An ongoing Phase 3 outcomes trial is evaluating Rezdiffra for the treatment of compensated MASH cirrhosis, consistent with stage F4C. For more information, visit www.madrigalpharma.com.
Liver Right and the Liver Right Scanning Network. On April 15th, 2025, Liver Right will open America's first virtual specialty clinic for liver disease, offering adults in all 50 states video appointments and helping GI practices and health systems triage and treat the swelling numbers of patients seeking MASLD and MASH testing. Liver Right offers same-week video visits and accepts insurance. For more information, contact Liver Right, that's liver, and then RIGHT at www.liverright.com.
Tawazin Health, your partner in global liver health innovation. At Tawazin Health, we specialize in providing small or large-scale access to FibroScan examinations for liver health-focused early detection, clinical trials, independent research, and collaborative projects with clinicians and FibroScan providers increasingly throughout the world. As industry-leading experts, we design and deliver high-quality FibroScan services because we know that accurate, high-quality, reliable data drives better outcomes. To learn about our sister lifestyle app, MyLife365.me, click the Tawazin Health link on the Surfing MASH homepage.
So this is Roger Green, executive producer and host of the Surfing the MASH Tsunami podcast, and we're back with episode 2 from season 6. It starts with a continuation of the Emerging Medical Trends Roundtable, where we discuss MetALD, ALD, and both the epidemiology of the disease and how various subcomponents, MASLD, MetALD, and ALD are both similar and different. We go on from there to a Newsmaker interview with one of our frequent experts, Hannes Hagstrom, who talks about a recent paper put out in the Journal of Hepatology by his team at the Karolinska Institute, taking a look at the different relative risk of death for MASLD and non-MASLD patients based on the disease cause of death. What we learn is, not surprisingly, HCC is the highest relative risk, but close to that is extrahepatic cancers. That said, because of what people die of, cardiovascular death is the leading cause of death within that population. And then finally, for our expert interview, we talked to somebody who isn't usually thought of as an expert. Emily Andeya is a primary care physician, an internist by training, practicing in Shelbyville, Indiana, who has made her professional career out of learning and getting more in depth and more engaged in issues of, first of all, metabolism, and now liver disease and steatosis. Last week, Naeem Al-Khoury talked about the field of steatology along with Mike Patel. Emily might be one of its practical practitioners. At any rate, all these are great events, great conversations, and I think you'll have a wonderful time. Enjoy, and we'll see you when you're done.
First, our roundtable discussion, part 2. Louise and Roger are joined by Professor Alexander Krag from the University of Southern Denmark, who is the current Secretary General of the European Association for the Study of the Liver, Dr. Alexander Lalos from Robert Wood Johnson Hospital, and Jen Lee Jones, founder of the Sober Livers Patient Support Group. Today, the discussion focuses on MetALD and ALD in terms of epidemiology, the idea that SLD is a continuum, and some of the keys for diagnosis and treatment.
With that said, let's turn to today's guests and get rolling with the business portion of our session. First of all, we have Louise. Hey, Louise, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. Nice to be back. Nice to see everybody on the other end of the screen.
Yeah. Since the last 6 months, how many times have you been to Australia?
3.
Yeah.
So it's nice to be in a decent time zone. Normally, this would be tomorrow for me.
Louise will sound alert and awake, and that's because it's not 2 in the morning in Perth. Well, it is 2 in the morning in Perth, but she's not in Perth. And she's awaiting eagerly a football match, 4 o'clock our time, that will determine exactly how successful Liverpool will be this year. Alexander Krag, how are you today, sir?
I'm good. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to come and join you here.
And thank you for joining. And you say a lot of rain in southern Denmark, huh?
No, we've actually had some pretty nice days here. We see the first flowers coming up. So spring is near, even here in the far north.
That's wonderful. It's wonderful. And then we have our good friend Jen Jones back with us again from Sober Livers. Hey, Jen, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Back from Vegas. I've been busy since I've gotten back because I realized when I take a short vacation or a conference, nobody's doing my job. So I came back to lots of emails and lots of work to do for our program.
Okay. Maybe you'll tell us a little bit about Vegas. And then our new guest, first-timer, is Alex Lalos. Alex is a hepatologist. He's on faculty at Rutgers and treats patients and is an advisor to our new sponsor, Liver Right. So, Alex, why don't you take a minute or two, tell everybody in the podcast world a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you came to be here today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I have a lot of interest in this field, actually, just being a clinical hepatologist. You know, we kind of went through the whole Hep C thing, and I just feel like the whole world has transitioned now into what this is probably the most significant liver disease. But it's good to join everybody. And Roger, I know you asked me to say something about me, and I guess I'm kind of boring. I don't really know what to say. But I will say one thing that probably people don't realize that much. I have a Greek name. I was born in the United States, but I'm really, really very Greek. Most of my cousins were born in Greece. I spent 3 or 4 summers there when I was a kid. I speak fluent Greek. I have an apartment in Athens. I have a couple of close relatives there. So sometimes when people meet me, they kind of get surprised that, they know their name is Greek, but they're kind of surprised how Greek I am. It's part of my identity. I listen to the music, but still an American at heart.
We now have a Greek American. If you're a resident/citizen of both Australia and England, what is the hyphenated phrase to describe that?
Let's put it this way, 60% of Perth is English. So I think you could call them Australian.
Okay.
POMs, which they're called from the other side. It's why the demographic of fatty liver disease is following everybody around the world.
Louise, what's that city in Australia that's 30% Greek? Melbourne or?
Sydney has a very big Greek community when I was living there, and they burnt down the cinema, the theatre, when you won the Euros, because I lived around the corner. They got a bit exuberant when you won that tournament. So I'd say Sydney's got a very big Greek community, but I think Melbourne does as well.
Let me use this moment to shift the conversation a little bit. Okay, I want to go back to Thursday afternoon. and the discussion about defining MetALD and the different challenges and issues, and why does it matter or why doesn't it matter. And so, Alexandra, do me a favor, please start by taking everybody through a little bit of what your talk was, and then summarizing how you saw some of the other issues that afternoon.
Yeah, so my talk was actually entitled Looking into the Epidemiology, and I think the back curtain of that is that maybe we have 3 million people around in the world living with liver disease, but what I tried to understand was actually that's the fact, and then we have the risk factors. Most of our countries, 80 to 9% drink after a certain age, 80 to 9% have a cardiometabolic risk factor, so this is just super widespread. The next thing is that if we take the knowledge we have now for face value, we have a growing prevalence of MASLD, which is where the most of the research has been, and now going from, let's say, 25 to almost 40% in some countries of this. But what I then matched it against is say, how does this add up with the fact that we have 25% of the people in most countries binge drinking, 12% with alcohol use disorder, alcohol dependence 5%. So that's what we call the steatotic liver disease burden paradox. Because also when we look in all of our clinics, who is actually in the ward? Who is the lead driver for liver transplantation? By far, that's alcohol-related liver disease. How can we have 40% that we say have steatotic liver disease or MASLD, and then 1 or 2% have ALD, and yet it's the other way around? So something is probably not right. So that's why I wanted to take a step deeper. Okay, why is that? And that was again to see, okay, can we understand? Are we missing the point? And that's back exactly to what we discussed before. If we don't know what is behind, we don't know how to target it. And that also goes for political level, epidemiological level, research level, drug development level. So that was my whole mission, to saying, okay, this does not add up. So likely, if we then look at the underreporting, the underdetection, for exactly the reason we have here, it's difficult for people to talk about. It's the whole story about stigma, self-stigma, systematic stigma. Let's not drink it too, but there are many reasons why people, there are cultural, there are religious aspects, many reasons why we don't target alcohol or get it. So the point is actually, if we then say the underdetection is ranging from the best studies, we had great people like Surfer Hannes and others say, we try to look into our 100% pure MASLD cohorts. 20% had high levels of alcohol when you measure it objectively. Other people in the clinical setting, it's 50%. If we then apply that to the world, then means it's probably that 30% or maybe 50% of what we think is MASLD is actually ALD or mid-ALD. So that brings a whole new perspective to this, and also where we should target. Hopefully also a wake-up call to the drug development drugs who think that there's a massive burden, that there is, but they should definitely have drugs that also target the other. Then my final point was also say, okay, how should we see the disease? Because what we know as clinicians, people, as patients, I'm sure Jen can confirm, you were not drinking like this your life, no. You had different goes like this. Could have periods of months or something. I show from one patient we've had in a study, but we have tons of them. For 3 months, this patient could be classified as MASLD, MASH, it has fibrosis. Then start drinking ALD, but then fell into intermediary and mid-ALD. So the problem is that this is not a static disease, and meaning that we go wrong as doctors, as researchers, as drug developers, if we just assess a one-time cross-sectional approach and say, no, you just said it, Jen, what do you have? If you have scarring in your liver, you haven't drinking for 8 years yet, what drove you there was alcohol. And that's the whole thing. So what we could show, I showed some data we did with 1,000 patients. We assessed 2 years in between. 38% changed their group. So what does it mean? It means that with clinicians, drug developers, etc., need to reassess the patients again. So the burden is massive, it's growing, but we have, as far as I can see with what knowledge we have, and again, the burden on transplant and in-hospital service underestimated the burden of alcohol. And that's a mistake we are trying to fix now by bringing it into light. So that was basically mine. And this also means that MetALD is not a bad thing, but it just needs, I guess, some more defining. How do we define the case? How do we account for historical use? How do we account for future use? And how do we actually use self-reported intake or the objective measures, PEth, etc.? And that's some of the things where research, and we need to refine it. It's not because the steatotic liver disease concept is bad, it just has some limitation. So in my world, no, you have to see this patient have steatotic liver disease, and then it moves a little bit back and forth. Could be for a few months it's more MASLD, and then it's more ALD. But you need to see it in a dynamic picture.
So, question. Except for the fact that ALD can progress significantly faster, in terms of how fast can you get to cirrhosis. Anna May Deal kind of raised this question, and we'll come back to that paper in a sec. How different is the treatment? I can understand why it would be more urgent. The more someone drinks, it becomes more urgent because alcohol is more immediately toxic. But are we really talking about three diseases, or are we talking about one continuum?
Definitely a continuum. And that's again what you see. That and the interesting thing, which you also had a great discussion there around, is the interaction between the risk factors. Alcohol, if you're lean or have a BMI above 30, alcohol is 4 times more toxic. So that means that a risk factor is not 1 + 1 is 2. No, 1 + 1 is 5. And that's, again, super important when we see our patient. And obese patients who also drink have more cardiometabolic risk factors definitely need more attention because these are the one progressing. And of course, and that's also very well documented now, the more alcohol you add, the faster the disease progresses. So that's, again, we need to see this holistic. And that's why people who are steering blind on alcohol, they miss the cardiometabolic factors because these are modifiable today. And to some extent, with some of the effective drugs, easily modifiable than in some people with alcohol, even though we should not ignore that different types of treatment approaches to alcohol can have significant impact in terms of reduction in alcohol intake.
Makes complete sense. I've got 7 questions in my mind, but I'm going to let you guys go ahead first.
I have a question for Alexander. And, we're both hepatologists. I tend to be a clinician, and I appreciate the research approach here. Where do you think, and I think this is the next cog that's going to be thrown in, what do you make of the genetics of this, the PNPLA3? That's obviously a disease modifier. Is that going to confuse it further? What's your impression on that, and where do you think it's going to go when you throw that into the mix?
Great question.
No, that's a great question. So if you look globally, 25% of the population have this risk gene. If you go to Latin America, it's even higher. If you go to other areas, it's lower. So that is definitely, if you look at the risk assessment, and again, it costs nothing to measure PNPLA3 SNP today. The problem is people just don't know how to use it. So I would see that if we then do polygenic risk factors, that could be, we also done several studies in kids, etc. If you already risk stratify them very early, because a gene is not very relevant if you already have cirrhosis or fibrosis, because then you're very close to the disease. But if you are earlier on, it's definitely something where you should have as a red flag if you are homozygous for this. And another thing which I think is very interesting, you can see that these drugs coming up that can actually silence or regulate these genes. It means that what we thought today was just the thing, no, this was something you could not change or modify. No, activation of genes today can be modified. And as long as an RNA level, it's not really a risky thing. So I see it's definitely something that will come, and I cannot see it should not be part of our drug development journey, but also risk stratification journey going forward.
Interesting.
I think that those are really great, very interesting. The gene conversation just blows my mind. Every time I listen to it, I hear about it because I'm just like, wow, how much stigma would that remove really from people if we can really push that this is really there's such a huge genetic component to this disease. I mean, if we could somehow, this could be a message that we get out to people, and it could also be an awareness factor so that it would make somebody possibly share how much alcohol they're drinking if they're told, hey, genetically, you could be inclined to have this disease. And you would say, oh, hey, I'm going to let them know how much I drink so that I could get this gene test, find out where it is. Broadly, this could be a great way of really dismantling the stigma. And if people would understand that it's, what did you say, Alexander, like 25%?
Globally, some regions, it's much higher, yeah.
Yeah. And what a message is that? And also what a message is with drug development is this modification of the genes, which I've talked to a couple of pharmaceutical companies, and I see that on the vision map there in the pipeline. And that's super exciting too, because then you can say to the patient, what if I tell you that there's this clinical trial right now that would help you possibly modify this gene and get you on a better path? We'd have to work on your alcohol use disorder, but we can do this, privately, and we don't have to really tell anybody about it. Let's find out what the best way is for you to recover. The gene information, it was very prevalent throughout the entire conference. So I'd really like to continue that conversation as we move forward.
And again, say the genes, that they're relevant in the presence of the risk factors, otherwise not. So that's again about how we try to link all this knowledge together.
Exactly.
Do we, Alexander, need to therefore define better hazardous drinking by people's background conditions, whether or not their BMI is at a certain level, whether or not they've got diabetes, whether or not they're lean, because it's not something that I see a lot in primary care awareness of. When I have conversations with people who are diabetic, overweight, and their alcohol intake is higher than the average or even the average, obviously that increased susceptibility of BMI, there's very little awareness of that in the primary care areas. So do we need to define that better so that it can be easily seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it starts with the stigma. If this was a party, we were all a little drunk, it was fun. But if you have a problem like Jen had, it's not so fun. Nobody wants to talk about it. So that's the conundrum we have. Alcohol is fun. It's cool to be a little bit drunk here and there. And that's our culture. It's very embedded. But as soon as it's a problem, everybody is not talking about it. But if we look back, again, in Hep C era, with us in many countries were led by IV drug abusers. But then suddenly it was a very fancy field because it was a lot of drugs, effective drugs coming in, a lot of money coming in. And you can see different fields also way back. Us has been in the business, cancer at a certain time, we could do nothing. Nobody really wants anything to do with it, or cardiac disease. So I think it's basically a transition. We can certainly do something about it and say that there's actually, it makes good sense to talk about it. And then I think also the what tools do we use to discuss it, to basically normalize it. Essentially, when we say that everybody drinks, and alcohol is not just associated with liver disease, or obesity is not just associated with liver disease, but a ton of other disease. So if we look at the attributable fraction of these lifestyle or behavior-related factors for the overall mortality, I cannot see any conversation in primary care or whatever that should not capture all of them. Cardiometabolic risk factors, smoking we already discussed, but now it's focused on alcohol, that we actually all develop a tool that we ask about it all the time and basically normalize the discussion about alcohol. And then we also have it repeatedly, because again, we know it goes like this. It may pop back or be reduced, and also how we see effects of the novel drugs we're introducing now. So definitely. And I think it should be a combination. We both use the audit, we discuss with people, we generate the trust so we actually feel comfortable, but also increasingly use the PEth test. The PEth test is a blood-based test that assesses and gives and kind of an average, like an A1C for diabetes, an average of alcohol consumption for the last 4 weeks. Then there are a lot of limitations to it. Let's not discuss that now, but we have a tool. So if we talk to people, we have an objective, just like we do with obesity, or we do with type 2 diabetes. We measure something, we talk. Why not do the same with alcohol? And then we can see how it changes over time. Okay, my target is to bring my PEF down. Okay, my target is to bring my BMI down, or to my A1C down, or blood pressure, or whatever. And just this is part of what we do when we engage with these patients. That will lead to significant success, and have this approach of treat to target like we've had in many other diseases.
Jen, can I ask, do you feel that if we tested alcohol after somebody's given us a history, does that confer confidence, or do you find that might do the opposite, just out of interest?
It's all about the approach, I think, and Alexander was talking a little bit about that. Taking away the fear from a patient as to why you're doing these tests is very important. It's important to say, one thing about this audit is I found out that the number one profession for substance use disorder are medical providers. What a great icebreaker for a patient, to say that. And make them feel like, we all, there's problems everywhere, every profession with alcohol, because it is so common, it's so social, and we use it for the wrong reasons a lot of times if you're depressive or anxious. And you talk to them first about why that test is being done and walk them through, I always say that wrong, A1C3, is that right?
Hemoglobin A1C, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I get tested for that. So I say it wrong. But it's explained what that test is, why it's being done many times. The education piece needs to be with the doctors about explaining and taking the fear away and saying, even if you come back with a high PEth, I'm not going to be upset with you. I'm going to understand that it's really hard for people to remember how much they drink or understand what a drink is. So this will be a way to compare that so that we can actually start measuring it properly. I think there's a way, but most definitely if it's done wrong, you're going to have people that aren't showing up for their appointments because they don't want to be tested, or they're saying, okay, can I postpone this for 2 weeks because I just went through a bender of drinking for a few days and I don't want that done right now. So you got to be careful. But if you're careful about it, I think it can be done.
Yeah, I want to tag in here because I was thinking about this during the meeting, and Louise, I kind of thought the same thing. There is actually papers on post-transplant that if patients know they're going to get PET tested, that it actually is linked with better sobriety. So there is that aspect to it. It definitely helps. But I do worry about that kind of punitive nature of it a little bit. And it does, as Jen said, come down to how the doctor does it. But I've seen it in my trainees. My trainees in particular, they have a very, it's almost like it's going to replace talking. And it's almost an aggressive thing where they even verbalize it. They make it a verb. I'm going to peth the patient. I've heard that term.
Oh, that's not good.
It sounds like pip, which is really scary.
No, that's not good.
But so I do worry because, I think there's studies to show that if people are heavy, they don't go to the doctor just because they don't want to get weighed and be told they're heavy, even though they may be going for some other reason. So I think it's a good thing, but I'm a little worried about it, and it has to be controlled.
I guess what you can do is always ask to say, what is this? It's just like you want consent to do anything else. I guess what I've heard where people really have conflict is that they take it and they didn't inform the patient. And then, of course, the patients are really frustrated because they feel cheated. I always tell them and say, okay, I get it's difficult to remember, but can I measure this? It's not because I'm here to help you. I tell nobody, that's again, see, I'm your lawyer, basically. I'm the one who's taking care of you. And then we can use this as part of conversation. And then we have maybe a target. And then we can say, okay, do you want to bring this down or something like that? That can be, I think, more positive way, because if it's perceived as a threat or as a doctor who's actually then cheating you, that's not very good for the confidence we have with the patients.
In today's Newsmaker segment, friend of the podcast and hepatology KOL professor Hannes Hagstrom joins Roger to discuss a paper he co-authored that was posted online by the Journal of Hepatology on March 24th, 2025, analyzing how living with MASLD and MASH might affect a patient's longevity and cause of death.
So, ironically, our expert this week was someone who's not normally thought of as an expert. Our newsmaker this week is someone that we've frequently relied on as an expert, Hannes Hagstrom. Hannes, how are you today, this evening?
I'm fine, Roger. How are you?
Fine. We were just commiserating on how busy we both were. This is going to turn out to be a more appropriate pairing than I originally thought. Our expert is a woman named Emily Ann Andeya, who's is part of a rural primary care practice in Indiana, where she on her own has gotten certified in everything you could ever imagine and fundamentally become a cardiosthetologist almost, if you will, with internal medicine background. And she was the one primary care doc who we were able to locate last year at AASLD, and then again at the Emerging Trends Conference. So I thought it would be interesting to have her come on and talk about how she got so interested in this area and what some of the challenges unique to primary care are. Well, if you take a look at the paper that we're going to be talking about, your JHEP paper, it's kind of on the other side of the same issue, right? Which is when we're dealing with MASLD patients, what are likely to be causes of mortality compared to the regular population? And if you were primary care or any other physician, what would you be on the lookout for?
Yeah, thank you, Roger. So, you're referring to our latest publication in Journal of Hepatology, where we looked at causes of death in patients with MASLD. So just for context, what we did is identify really all patients in Sweden within a certain time frame that had a diagnosis of MASLD. So it's sort of a selected cohort because, as we all know, MASLD is so underdiagnosed, but it's at least all patients in Sweden who received a diagnosis of MASLD turned out to be around 13,000 patients. And so what we did was look at, both relative but also absolute estimates of mortality. And it turns out that these patients, they have, increased mortality for almost all causes of death you can think about, except for one thing, and that was psychiatric diseases. But increased rates of death for, of course, certainly liver and HCC and so on, where the relative risks are quite high if you compare it to the general population, which is something we can do. But confirming what we know from before, that these patients mostly die from cardiovascular disease and extrahepatic cancer. But it's also quite a nice paper just because you can get some pretty good absolute estimates to convey to patients saying, well, your risk of death, if you're a standard sort of MASLD patient, your risk of death would be sort of this and that. And then, of course, you need to add on more granular data on fibrosis stage and age and so on to be able to fine-tune that. But at least it's like a roadmap you can take to the average MASLD patient, I would say.
I think it's not only the average patient, though. I mean, if you think about treaters who are not so aware of MASLD, they wouldn't know any of these things either. A year and a half ago, a patient advocate told me that if you deal with MASLD, you're in the business of treating liver cancer. Well, one of the things that comes out of your paper is that that's right, but that's not nearly sufficient enough, right? That the risk ratio for the extrahepatic cancers wasn't a lot different than it was for HCC, right? One was 35 and the other was 26, if I remember correctly.
I'll have to bring up the paper now, Roger. You're putting me on the spot here.
But both huge numbers, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what we can see from this is you get sort of the high relative risk is for liver disease because that's so rare in the general population. But and in absolute terms, you still get quite high numbers of 15-year mortality, which is what we try to estimate in this paper.
First thing was 15-year mortality was higher in general, right? Significantly higher.
Yes, exactly.
And then second was that the greatest risk ratios were for hepatic and extrahepatic cancers, but more of the deaths came from extrahepatic and cardiovascular disease.
Yes, which is sort of in comparison to what we know already, right? But this is sort of putting those numbers into maybe a more less selected context, because as we know, previous data is mostly from our tertiary care centers, and it's biopsy based. And I know, as you all know, that the further we go away from the biopsy, the more selected biopsy patients will be, because now we mostly do biopsies if we want to rule out other diseases, or if we don't trust the FibroScan or MRE data or the other non-invasives. So at least that is when we do biopsies, and of course for clinical trials and so on. But the biopsy patients are becoming more and more selected. So this is another way to look at the MASLD population. And I would say that the estimates are sort of, or the general findings are sort of comparable to what we know from before. But it puts the sort of, you can take the average, you can take the risk estimates, and I think it's a bit more generalizable than the biopsy data.
That makes sense. That makes tremendous sense. How do you envision, you said you can see using the results of this paper to create algorithms you can use to teach patients about where their risk is?
Well, not necessarily create algorithms, but you can sort of you can at least use this data to inform your patient. You're newly diagnosed with MASLD. So what we did is we calculated, all the risk estimates are calculated from the date of diagnosis. So these patients certainly have had MASLD prior to that time point, because often the diagnosis is made incidentally. But at least from the time point where you're diagnosed with MASLD, you can see what's the sort of average mortality rate and what are the risks also compared to what we could do here is, we compare all risk estimates to matched controls. So if you're a 55-year-old man with MASLD, your sort of risk estimates are extrapolated to 55-year-old men without a known diagnosis of MASLD. So, and then we of course present some subgroup analysis in the paper, which you have to read and then cite in your own papers. So looking at subgroups such as men and women and so on.
First of all, I think it's helpful. I agree with you. It's helpful to have a paper that looks at a broader population, and you're comparing about 13 or something in the teens of thousands of MASLD patients, or something in the 120.
Yeah, 13,000 patients. Yeah,
huge numbers, right? So that's helpful in and of itself. Do you expect that most hepatologists would not know the exact numbers, but understand the basic ranges, and then extend beyond that to other specialties in primary care? Would this be news to people who don't know a lot about MASLD?
Yeah, I guess you have to ask them, right? Maybe. I think most people know that MASLD, as you alluded to before, people think that this is maybe a deadly disease, and sometimes when we talk to patients, they are really upset, and they think they maybe have a high risk for cancer and imminent death. And so what trying to tell people, well, this is unless you have advanced fibrosis at the time of diagnosis, you can consider this a risk factor, and this is your mortality risk towards the general population. So you're at roughly a twofold increased rate of death compared to sort of a person in your age and your sex that didn't have MASLD in general. It might be higher even if we see that you have cirrhosis. It might be maybe lower if you didn't have cirrhosis, and it's probably going to go down even further if we treat it, or if we look at your risk factors and can handle your risk factors. So it's a sort of a rough estimate to what a patient in your situation might experience experience. And I think that kind of big data can be valuable for some patients to sort of just show you like, oh, wow, I have a twofold higher risk of death. I need to do something about it. So it can be motivating in those kind of instances, but also maybe reassuring for some people, because you can see also that it's not a super high risk. You're not going to die in 1 year or so. So I think it can be reassuring. And from previous studies with smaller sample sizes, it's also important to say that if you don't have any fibrosis, your mortality is probably even lower. So this is these 13,000 patients. We have to weigh in the positive and negative things for these kind of studies. The positive thing is very little selection bias, because essentially we identify anybody in Sweden with this diagnosis. And of course, the negative thing is that we have less granularity, so we don't really know what's the stage of the disease. But we also have very little loss to follow-up, so we can follow them for essentially until they die or move from Sweden, which quite few people do. We should have more people coming to Sweden. Especially from the US now.
Yeah, I think that's a coming thing. I agree. I was struck by how many people at the last medical meeting I was at were talking about trying to figure out what other countries they could live in so they could continue their research. For those who do not see the smile on Hannes' face, I suspect he might casually be anticipating this will be good for research.
Yeah, so talk to me at next meeting if you want to know how to live in Sweden. It's pretty good.
Yeah, but So have you been using these data yet to talk to your patients, or have your colleagues been?
No, I mean, this is just out, but this is just out right now or something. So I'm not sure when it is going to be broadcasted, but it's pretty new. But we did a press release from our institution, and it turned out actually to be quite popular. So we've been contacted by journalists from, even from Brazil and from France, and then so on and so forth. So it seemed to be quite popular piece, but we're definitely gonna use it. And I would really like to also commend the sort of senior author here, Axel Wester, is assistant professor in my group, and medical student Gabriel Issa, who sort of did the statistics and wrote the paper mostly. So I'm just sitting here and taking credit for these guys' hard work, but those are really the people who did the bulk of the work. And I think it's really nice that there are strong people in our group that have taken an interest in this. But one good thing that they did is presenting this in a pretty, I think, nice graphically way. So you can, show this graphically and say like, okay, this is actually how it looks like in a pretty simple way, at least I think for healthcare providers and also for patients. So you can see like, okay, then you put it into context. So it's not black and white, but you can get a better understanding, I think.
So will this lead to more work following on from this, or is this kind of where we're going to take this? And I know you're working on technical terms, scads of other things at the same time.
Yeah, I think we're doing quite a lot of projects right now, so it's very exciting, and we hope to see more work, of course, coming out from this. So what we hope to do is certainly to be able to take this to the next level, which would be to involve more granular data. And now we have a cohort coming out with a few publications where we actually have lab data from most patients in Stockholm with liver tests, so around 840,000 people with liver data, blood work. So that would enable us to take at least the population of Stockholm, which is around 2 million people, and try to use at least non-invasive data. So what we're always coming to this conundrum that MASLD is still a sort of silent disease, and the patients that we do collect in our respective studies, they are sort of a bit selected. So we have to probably use these kind of big data sources, but then you get to reduce the selection bias, but then you get lower granularity. So how can we get as much data as possible out from these big data sources with less tendency to selection bias to really sort of try to study and communicate the risk of outcomes in this population. And there's also some exciting work now in trying to digitalize radiology data. Radiology data has been quite difficult to get a hold of and categorize, but there are some work both in the US that I know of and also here in Sweden trying to better convert that data into something that can be analyzed and put into a risk algorithm.
And so what is the benefit that comes from that specifically, radiology data in that regard?
Because then you can really know if the patient had MASLD or not, right? Otherwise we are stuck with these non-invasive scores like fatty liver index and so on, which will always be a little shaky, I think.
Okay, so that's exciting. You're right. That would be fantastically exciting. At least until we get to better NITs, that's kind of what has to happen. So what other kinds of things are you working on besides in this area that you think are particular?
Yeah, so we're working quite a lot of stuff. I would mention that we have we hope to get it published rather soon, a sort of a new non-invasive risk score. And this is a little bit new to what's been done, where all the existing risk scores that we have, or most at least, they are using either biopsy or FibroScan as the gold standard. So they're a diagnostic model. We want to diagnose how much fibrosis does the patient have. Yeah. But that is maybe not the most interesting thing. So I think the most interesting thing is to know if a patient will develop outcomes or not. In cardiology, we don't go and look for atherosclerosis. We look at 10-year risk for major adverse cardiovascular events, and then you treat patients above a certain risk threshold. And I think that's something we can try to copy also in hepatology. So this is what one of our statisticians have been working on the last couple of 2 or 3 years, doing a risk prediction model where you, based on very simple labs, just 3 lab parameters, age and sex, can calculate a person's risk to develop cirrhosis within 10 years. So it's based on around 800,000 people and extensively validated, and it outperforms at least FIB4. So we hope to get that published hopefully soon. And then the next step would be to compare it to other risk algorithms. But that will sort of transition us from looking at the diagnostic models to more looking at prediction. And I think that's the next step we need to do to take this really into primary care, because I think current risk prediction models in primary care don't work. FIB4 is pretty good, but it's not that good. So we're going to end up with huge numbers of patients that needs a FibroScan, and it's not just going to be feasible, I think. So we need something else, and I think changing the perspective to predicted risk is one way to go. But of course, there's a lot of work needing to be done there as well.
Now, is that AI type work?
No, I think I would
not radiologic AI, but AI as they do in consumers, where they take large databases and look for common factors.
Yeah, exactly. But I think this work has been done by a sort of expert prediction modeler in my group, and it's mostly using standard biostatistical principles and methods. But I think he might have tried a few AI things here and there as well. But mostly, just the standard things that statisticians are quite aware of.
Fantastic. And with the goal of ultimately making all of this more accessible to primary care and to patients.
Yes, exactly. Because then you can but the next step would then be to know, okay, at what risk threshold would you sort of start to treat a patient, or at what risk threshold should you refer a patient? So this will give you not, what we also have right now, is you label patients as being at high risk, intermediate risk, low risk. Whereas this model will actually give you a number. So it will tell you, based on these factors, your risk for cirrhosis within 10 years is 5.1%, or is 0.1%, or it's 20%,
5.1 is scary enough. You don't have to go to 20
exactly.
to scare me.
But you need to still do some health economical evaluations to see, okay, is it health economically feasible to start treating patients maybe with resmetirom or a GLP-1 or whatever at a certain risk threshold, and that will of course depend on the side effect of the drugs, the price of the drug, and so on and so forth. But at least I think it's a start, and it would be also very cool to try to see if this algorithm that we have developed, how will it work in more of because this is now in a general population, so it will be interesting to see how does it actually work in more sort of sicker patients with biopsy-proven MASLD. Actually, what happens also in patients that you treat in clinical trials? Do their predicted risk go down, which would be another NIT to look at, but I think that could be pretty cool as a treatment response parameter as well, but that has to be, of course, separately validated.
Trial involvement?
I would be happy to talk to anybody in the trial environment who is interested in that kind of things, and maybe this sort of algorithm needs to be recalibrated to that setting, because those are different patients with different risk for outcomes. But so this is a general population model. But I think that is currently where these kind of models are mostly usable. In the clinical environment, we will always have our invasive things, and we will have biopsy, we will always have FibroScan and so on. And probably we can trust those a bit more than a blood-based algorithm. But as a first sort of sorting tool, I think this can be a pretty interesting thing.
Well, that's fantastic. And while we're here, anything else you want to share with people listening to this podcast about what you're up to, what you find interesting?
It's just good to have...
Besides, come to Sweden. It's a great place to do research and live.
Exactly, Roger. You're welcome. We have to have more meetings in Sweden so people come and see. But I would say if you want to come to Sweden, you should do it in the summer, because it's not from the best side in November when it's dark and rainy. But come in June, it's going to be amazing.
So on my honeymoon, by the way, I spent the summer, the longest day of the year, sitting on the rooftop of a hotel in Stockholm, sipping aquavit and smoking cigars till 2 a.m, and just looking north at the lights. It was
and it didn't get dark, right?
No, it didn't get dark.
Yeah, exactly.
It didn't get dark. That and 3 days earlier being at the Tivoli Gardens when they put the fireworks off at 11:30, because that was when it was dark enough in Copenhagen to see the fireworks.
Yeah.
I said, this is different.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, my friend. I look forward to seeing you in a couple of months. Ideally in Amsterdam would be great. And
you'll be in Amsterdam. I will actually be in New York next week for this ALD Alley meeting. So looking forward to that, to talk to some people about MetALD as well. So looking forward to that. I'm actually terrified because I have to debate Rohit Loomba. So it's always going to be challenging.
That's a fascinating thing to do. My hat's off to you, my friend.
Thank you.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Finally, primary care physician Emily Andeya, who was described from the platform at AASLD last November as a unicorn, as in role model. We will discuss how she became so interested in MASLD and MASH, how that interest is manifested when she treats patients, and the challenges she finds in fostering better liver health in her patients.
Okay, so I'm here now with this week's expert interview. As I mentioned last week, we're going to use expert a little differently than we have in the past. When we talked in the past about experts, we were talking about global key opinion leaders. This year, what we're going to do is we're going to speak with different stakeholders, many of whom are key opinion leaders, who touch this entire process of identifying and treating patients from different perspectives. In that regard, one of the important perspectives is actually primary care practices. If you think about it, right now, there's about one hepatologist in the U.S. for every 40,000 MASLD patients. Obviously, that's not going to work in terms of treatment paradigms. And we'll talk during the year about different treatment approaches, but a lot of this is going to land in primary care. I have with me today as our guest, and she'll be with us a few times throughout the year, Dr. Emily Andeya, a primary care practitioner outside of Indianapolis, Shelbyville, right? Shelbyville, Indiana. Is that right, Emily? Do I have that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And we've met a couple of times in person.
Yeah.
The first being last year at AASLD, when Emily and I both attended a session on preventive hepatology. Main focus was preventive hepatology. And in fact, the specific talk by Oren Fix was about preventive hepatology. And Emily asked a question, after which Dr. Fix described her as, and I quote now, a unicorn. The kind of 1 in a million that we're looking for in primary care that we don't have nearly enough of, based on the scope of her interest in liver disease. So if that wasn't unicorn enough, Emily also showed up at the Emerging Trends Conference in Vegas with her entire team. And I believe she was probably the only primary care physician in the room, certainly the only one that I was able to come in contact with during the 2 days of the meeting. We'll be talking a few times during the year, starting today, about what it actually means to want to focus on liver disease in a primary care practice, things that are making it easier, things that are making it harder, and how those will change over the course of the year. Emily, welcome.
Thank you, Roger. It's really my pleasure to be here today.
My pleasure to have you. Go ahead. Maybe a tad nervous. I think this is the first time you've ever done a major podcast, yeah?
Yes, it is, and I'm very excited and scared at the same time.
Well, a healthy fear is a great motivator. All that's going to do is make you better guests, so I'm not worried about that. Do me a favor, do all of us a favor. Start by telling us a little bit about your background, how you came to be in medicine and primary care, how you got to where you are today. Okay.
I think I cannot make that little bit, but let me start by stating that I'm from the Philippines. I was born and raised in the Philippines, and that's also where I finished my medical school. I have a family history of diabetes, hypertension, and actually my aunt died of a heart attack at the age of 50 when I was at the medical school. So after that happened, it was very clear to me that I wanted to be a cardiologist. That's why I went to internal medicine residency, because I want to prevent patients from prematurely dying from heart attack and stroke. But then life happened and I got married and I have to go to the United States. So instead of going to fellowship in cardiology, I went back to nursing school because I didn't know if I'm going to be a doctor here in the United States. So I worked as a nurse in San Diego for 5 years until I went to my residency training in family medicine in Michigan. After residency, I went to primary care practice and I was hired at major health partner in Shelbyville, Indiana. It is a rural health community hospital around the suburban Indiana. But during my first few years, one of my greatest challenge was taking care of patients with obesity. And I just find them very complicated, especially if they already have diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And so that became I was actually really, really scared of taking care of them because I find them very complicated. But I cannot change the fact that I need to face them every day. So I have to face my challenge, and I took a board certification and I learned more about obesity, and I became board certified in obesity medicine. That's where I realized the relationship of insulin resistance and cardiovascular diseases, and cardiometabolic disease became my obsession. And I figured out that I really know how little I know about cardiometabolic disease. And that is why I became board certified also in clinical epidemiology, lifestyle medicine, advanced diabetes management, and cardiometabolic health certification. I also joined American Society of Preventive Cardiology and now a fellow. I regularly attended heart and diabetes conferences and World Congress in Insulin Resistance. And in our practice to improve our care for our patients, our hospital or our practice joined the American Heart Association outpatient program, which we call Target BP, cholesterol, Target Diabetes. These programs have a goal of preventing patients from dying of heart disease and stroke. And with those programs, we achieved gold certification for at least 5 years. And we can attribute that success with our partnership with Cardiometabolic Center Alliance, or what we call CMCA. And that's how we started our cardiometabolic program, and I am the medical director of that program in our hospital. So what is CMCA? CMCA, it's an alliance or a collaboration of healthcare organizations committed to improving the quality of care and outcome of patients with cardiometabolic disease by focusing on comprehensive risk reduction. And that is through implementing guideline-directed medical treatment and team-based approach for taking care of high-risk and very high-risk patients, especially those with prediabetes and diabetes that are already affected by cardiovascular disease and renal disease. And our team includes primary care providers, nurse managers. We also have pharmacists, and we also partnered with cardiologists and nephrologists. So this alliance actually consists of cardiologists and university hospitals throughout the country. And this was led by Dr. Mikhail Kasubord, who's a cardiologist whose expertise is in cardiometabolic medicine. This is now led by Dr. Andrew Sauer. So with regards to that alliance, we were the first primary care member of this alliance. Initially, their confidence with us was very low. Why? Because we're primary care. We're not cardiologists. And in addition to that, we're in a rural healthcare setting. So their confidence is really low. But then we were able to prove that even in primary care, we can do well. So we actually performed really well. And MHP, our hospital, became one of the top performers in that alliance. And then also with the American Heart Association programs, we were one of the few participants who achieved what they call perfect trifecta in diabetes, cholesterol, and blood pressure.
When you say did really well or achieved perfect trifecta, what level of performance are we talking about there?
So we were able to surpass the benchmarks for the blood pressure. So for the blood pressure, it means blood pressure control of our population more than 80%. And with the diabetes, hemoglobin A1C, meaning hemoglobin A1C of 9 and less, to more than 80% of our patients, and also in cholesterol. So with those success, we were successful because we're looking at the disease process as a complication of a common pathology called insulin resistance that affects the heart and the kidneys. But guess what? So is the liver. Liver is also affected, right? Right. Fatty liver is now what we call a MASLD, is insulin resistance manifestation in the liver. So during our practice, even if we were successful in taking care of those other comorbid conditions, we see patients that are affected by liver cirrhosis, hepatocellular cancer, hepatic encephalopathy, because of fatty liver as a consequence of that insulin resistance in the liver. But also knowing that insulin resistance is the main cause of cardiovascular disease and renal problem, and also the relationship of fatty liver and all those chronic diseases. And I realized we're just taking care of the complications of fatty liver. We can actually control all of that. That's just the downstream of the disease process. And I am thinking maybe we can make a big difference if we go a little bit upstream. And what is upstream? And that is the liver. And so after realizing that, fatty liver, MASLD, became my next obsession. And so I started listening to podcasts. Your podcast is one of the things that I listen to, and I listened a lot to the talks of Dr. Noureddin and Dr. Al-Khoury, and that's how I ended up attending the AASLD. And I remember them asking me, as a primary care physician, how did I ended up on that conference? But just like in clinical lipidology and preventive cardiology, I was asked that a lot, and some of them mentioned, you're getting out of your box. And I'm thinking, why should we be put in a box? We take care of the same patients. And for me to be able to really take good care of that patient, I need to expand my knowledge. So that's why now I am obsessed in that fatty liver.
So I remember that at AASLD, the comment that you made that Dr. Fix accorded you unicorn status as primary care was specifically what you just said, which is that AHA has put into place this program and they're tracking these things. But why aren't they tracking liver? Because all this really starts in the liver anyway. How many primary care folks have you met in your journeys who are looking at this the same way you are, or taking the same effort, really?
I think on that AASLD, there's one practice that's already screening patients for fatty liver. I didn't get the opportunity to talk to them. I don't think that I am the only one. I'm sure that there's a lot out there.
Oh, I'm sure you're not the only one. But, there are enough primary care practices that if 10% of them were doing it, that would either be a lot or a drop in the bucket, depending upon how you want to look at it, right? A lot of practices, but not a large percentage.
Yes, but I'm going to tell you that it's not easy to do what we are expected to do. So just to share my experience in my practice, when I started looking at fatty liver, so the guideline says screen your patients with FIB-4 score. So when I started doing that, and I've seen a lot of patients whose FIB-4 score is more than 1.3, which is the threshold for investigating further, my next question was, okay, what am I going to do with this FIB-4-3? They need to be evaluated with another non-invasive testing or referred to gastroenterologist or hepatologist. Mm-hmm. But guess what? There's a lot of patients, and it's more than half of my patients, and I cannot expect to send all those patients to hepatologists or gastroenterologists. During that time, we didn't have our gastroenterologist yet. So I was able to convince our hospital to purchase initially ultrasound elastography and eventually the vibration-controlled transient elastography, only because most of our patients wouldn't want to see a specialist, and a specialist probably don't want to see a referral only based on the FIB-4 score. So when we are able to do the second non-invasive testing, which is the elastography, another problem that we have found is that we're able to see a lot of patients that are F2 and higher, meaning they are at risk for fibrosis and cirrhosis. We were lucky to be able to have a gastroenterologist hired in our hospital, but then again, seeing this 200 patients at risk for cirrhosis, that's a lot of patients for one gastroenterologist to take care of, not to mention those patients that needs endoscopy and other liver problems. This is just one of the many gastro problems that they need to take care of. The good news is that in our practice, we have what we call a cardiometabolic clinic, wherein we are already taking care of patients who are at risk for cardiovascular disease. And we're already using the GLP-1 receptor agonist medications. I remember in one of your talks, you had Dr. Al-Khoury talk about the ESSENCE trial, the use of semaglutide in patients with MASLD. And in most of our patients, we're already using this medication. But if you remember Dr. Noureddin, I love Dr. Noureddin because he makes a lot of sense. He used the language of the diabetes, comparing it to MASLD. If the hemoglobin A1C is not enough, right, you add another medication. So we're already already using the GLP-1 receptor agonist, but our patients will still benefit from the liver-targeted therapy.
Have you started using Rezdiffra yet in your practice?
Yes, we have, but that was a big hurdle as well, because when it was first started, the good thing is that we were already able to identify those patients at risk even before the resmetirom was approved. But during that time, there was a talk that it should only be prescribed by hepatologists. But like you said, we don't have an access to hepatologists. So what I did is I was able to get hold of the rep of the Madrigal and ask them, can you tell me the reason why primary care should not be able to prescribe the resmetirom? So they helped us with using the resmetirom. And I studied about, we look at the medication, what are the things that we need to look for. And it looks like we were confident in using that medication and monitoring our patients for that medication in our cardiometabolic and liver health center. And so we're able to use that right now. And we're working with a gastroenterologist with regards to that. One thing that we did that I probably didn't mention is because of all of that, we were able to change our practice, wherein we had what we call cardiometabolic and liver health center, meaning we are using it as a bridge between specialists and primary care. So this is where we are sending now our patients that has F2 and higher, and this is where we are using the resmetirom, and we have physician assistant who's specifically just taking care of patients who have fibrosis.
So it's interesting. It seems that you've put all these initiatives into play that make you look less like a primary care practice and more like a metabolic practice. I don't know if you heard last week's episode, but Mike Battelle was talking about how Naeem Al-Khouri has now coined the phrase steatology. You almost sound to me like what a steatologist would be. And since there's no board certification for steatology, you don't have to worry about not having one, right? Is that, am I right about that? Is this kind of, if there was such a thing as a steatology practice, is this kind of where, the ground level, is this kind of what that practice would be doing?
Probably like that too, but it's not just limited to the steatology, because we're also connecting it to the cardiology, hypertension, and diabetes. And that's what this cardiometabolic CMCA is for. I think this is where the future of the medicine is going to. We are breaking silos. He broke his silo, right? That's what he broke his silo. That's what he's doing. I broke my silo. We're breaking our silos. One of the good thing with what's going on right now is that with the medications, it has a lot of indications now. The GLP-1s are no longer limited to the endocrinologist and primary care. Cardiologists are using it too. And even pulmonologists are going to use it too. And Dr. Al-Khouri, he's starting to use that. So maybe it's a different specialty called steatology will be appropriate. But I think Dr. Al-Khouri, I'm looking at him as a cardiometabolic hepatologist.
That's interesting because Ken Kuzi described him as the first endohepatologist a few years ago. In fact, we joked about this a little bit last week. You can put all these things together. You can be a Barry endohepatologist. You can be a cardio-Barry endohepatologist. You can be a cardiopulmonary endo-Barry hepatologist, because all that stuff comes into play in the general metabolic space, right?
True.
So what are some of the factors that you haven't mentioned yet that are limiting your ability to be effective delivering this kind of care?
So as a primary care, if I'm going to put myself as a primary care, one is screening for those patients. You need to know that in primary care, you mentioned about tsunami, right? In primary care, we don't even know how to swim. We are already drowning. How much more surfing? Yeah. Because we're not only taking care of the liver, we're also taking care of a lot of things. We're also taking care of simple common cold, everything under the sun. And taking care of patients with fatty liver is not that simple. Simply calculating the FIB-4 score, even if we only have 4 parameters, it takes a lot of time, and that can put us behind. That is one thing, is taking the time to do it. That's why some primary care doctors will just say, okay, I don't have time to do that today. We'll maybe do that. Hopefully next time we'll have time.
Emily, does your hospital have an Epic system?
We don't.
Or Cerner? Neither?
We don't have Cerner, but we were able to, calculating the FIB-4 score, we were able to solve that problem. But we have a data specialist who made a program out of our system. And we have a group, what we call quality team, that is looking at all those FIB-4 scores of our patients and sending a message to the primary care doctor. For example, for my patients on my schedule tomorrow, they look at all those patients and look at those FIB-4 score and give us a message, send us a message and say, hey, your patient, you're going to see her tomorrow. Her FIB-4 score is 1.3. You might want to discuss doing further testing with that patient. So we're able to find a solution to that problem. But it's not easy, but there's always way, but more resources.
Can you give one or two more examples of things that are hard for you to get done that we might not? Look, start with this, right? Primary care is what, an average 15-minute visit and 19 minutes worth of stuff to cover, at least, before you even get to fatty liver disease. So one question becomes, how do you make time in the visit to do that? Are the visits longer, or are you taking time away from something else? How does that work?
So one of the things, the good thing that's happening now is yes. The answer is yes. It takes more time. It shouldn't be a punishment for us because now we're into what we call, instead of volume-based, we are now into value-based care, wherein we can charge for time. So even if that is a struggle, if you really want to do it, we can do it. But another problem is with regards to screening for MASLD is also screening for alcohol intake. That is one of the things that I realized that we need to do better in primary care. You need to realize we're screening for a lot of things: depression screening, cardiovascular, a lot of calculations, and sometimes the alcohol intake, we oftentimes neglect it. And we realize now how important it is, because if we really want to be aggressive in taking care of these patients, we need to take time in knowing what's their alcohol, how much is their alcohol intake. And with that, we are seeing a lot of patients who has problem with alcohol. We just realized that they have that problem. So now that we have this cardiometabolic and liver health program, we realize we need to have a more structured program for alcohol cessation. And that is not our strength, and that needs to be stronger.
So how do you deal with that now?
So right now, we do have behavioral specialists that can give medication for our patients, but we realize that as primary care doctors, we need to have more knowledge in taking care of those patients. There's a lot of medications we can use. We just need to incorporate them to use them more to help our patients become more successful.
So, Emily, we're now 27 minutes into what's supposed to be a 20 to 25-minute interview, and I could go on for hours. So let me ask just a couple of quick closing questions. First of all, let me tell everybody that if Emily's willing, I'd like to have her back every maybe 8 or 10 weeks so that we can continue this conversation. And if you have questions that you would like to ask Emily about primary care and how you can work better with primary care, or if you're in primary care, how you can accomplish things better, please send them to us at questions@surfingmash.com. We'll forward them to Emily. She can get back to you directly. We can get back to you because I think this is really, what you're doing is really extraordinary. It really, I mean, this is unicorn stuff. This is legitimate one of the million stuff, or one of 100,000 stuff. It's just great. So let me just ask you, what do you see changing for you over the next 6 to 8 months?
So I think I will not concentrate on just changing with me, but I think what's changing in medicine, we have now a lot of other organizations that is increasing awareness for fatty liver. American Heart Association, I mentioned about the CKM, or Cardiometabolic Presidential Advisory. They did mention there that patients needs to be screened for MASLD. American Diabetes Association is also recommending screening for those patients. But I am seeing now that what I am hoping to change is for primary care practice to have access to the second NITs and not just get stuck with the first NIT, which is, or non-invasive testing, which is the FIB-4 score. I'm hoping to see more primary care doctors have access to vibration-controlled transient elastography or other tests, so they can really streamline those patients that needs to go to the gastroenterologist or hepatologists. And I'm hoping to see more of that breaking silos. I'm hoping to see more of Dr. Naim Al-Khouri.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping to see cardiologists screening for fatty liver as well.
So then just one more thought on that. Right now, it just came to mind, it's a digression a bit, but how much use does your FibroScan machine get at your place? What proportion of the week is it actually used?
Maybe to answer that, for the whole year, we have scanned 1,500 patients. So we are scanning around 5 to 10 patients per day, 5 to 6 days a week.
So that's decent utilization, maybe 3-4 hours a day, 2-3 hours a day?
Maybe 4 per hour.
So you're getting good value out of it. It could be used more.
It could be used more, yes.
Okay, that's great. So what other one message would you like to leave for people who are listening to this interview today? Noting that we'll be happy to get questions over to you, and that we'll have you back in a couple of months, and we'll keep this going forward.
So one more message that I'm going to say is that knowing that all of these cardiometabolic diseases, including MASLD, is coming in as a tsunami, but with the changes in medicine right now, I'm very hopeful that we have more tools in our toolbox to better take care of these patients. But one important thing is we are drowning right now with the downstream effect of cardiometabolic disease. We need to screen them earlier, even in children. They have fatty liver. They already have fatty liver. They already have fibrosis. But I think we can make a big difference if we screen them early and look at their liver and look at the liver as an end organ damage. I think a behavior change can happen if they see that one of their organs is being affected. And I think that can make a big difference.
My colleague Louise would probably stand up and applaud at that moment, because as you know, because you listen, she believes that strongly. Emily, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
By the way, this is slightly heroic. Emily was on vacation with her family in Hawaii. They landed in Indianapolis at 2 o'clock this morning. She was left for 4 hours. She's in the middle of doing laundry. She had to tell the kids to turn off the washer while she was on the interview, so we didn't hear noise in the background. It's just been great speaking with you today. We'll see you again soon. We'll have you back on, and I'm sure people are going to find this a fascinating interview. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
And here's Roger with our Season 6, Episode 2 business report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. Here's hoping that a broadening ceasefire will come to represent a just peace and not simply the U.S. pushing one side to capitulate. We'll see as time goes by.
Thanks for last week.
We have two signs that last week marked a successful return and kickoff for our new format. First, our 7-day audited listener numbers would have ranked number 4 out of 26 in 2024, despite the fact that last year's episode centered largely on the Resmetirom approval, launch, and recommendations, and our coverage of the EASL Congress 2024. 7 or 8 of those 26 episodes would usually be really high scoring. We did better than about half of those last week. Second, I've received feedback in the form of IMs and emails from friends and some listeners I don't really know very well, telling me that the new format worked better and also that listeners appreciated the shorter segments. Going forward, please share any feedback or suggestions you have, including guests we might feature as experts or newsmakers, subjects we might cover, etc. We know what we're trying to build here, or perhaps to rebuild, and your opinions are invaluable to us as we move forward.
Attention sponsors, we will share a publication schedule with anyone looking to decide how to participate.
We now have a publication schedule for 2025, discussing the topics and drop dates for each roundtable, along with the names of some of our experts. We're still completing that panel. Of course, the newsmakers will reflect what happens in a given week, so we will have no advance schedule for that portion of the episode.
Okay, listeners, where would you like to see Roger?
I'm compiling my own list of conferences to attend later this year. Part of that will be a function of how much sponsor funding we bring in, but the rest will reflect your suggestions. Let me know which conferences you think I should attend and cover in person beyond the obvious, and thanks in advance for your feedback.
And that wraps up Season 6, Episode 2 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami. On behalf of the surfers, our guests, and our sponsors, Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, Liver Right, and Ta Wizen Health, thanks for joining us this week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Join us again next week when our Roundtable on the Emerging Topics Conference continues. Our newsmakers discuss an intriguing new option for diagnosing challenging patients, and our expert looks at advances in NITs.
Until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you next week again on Surfing MASH Tsunami. Bye-bye now.